The Robert Fortenbaugh Memorial Lecture is presented on November 19th, the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. The goal of the lecture is to honor the memory and spirit of Lincoln's visit to Gettysburg by bringing a renowned scholar to provide a public lecture about a topic related to the American Civil War. Our speaker this evening will be introduced by my colleague, Professor Peter Carmichael, Director of the Civil War Institute, and I believe we are in for a treat.
Thank you so much, Dina. Before we get started, I just want to extend a big thank you to my staff at CWI, Jill Titus, Ashley Lusky, and especially Heather Miller, who is, where's Heather? She's back there someplace. They always do a masterful job, and this is no exception. I also want to just do a quick plug. Happy again to see you all in person. We're especially happy to see you all in person. Second weekend of June, the Civil War Institute Conference, been canceled for 2 years. We're back in action second weekend of June at Gary Gallagher, Carrie Janey. Dr. Reardon is here. She's on the faculty this year. Jeffrey Wirt, a really all-star cast, so we'd love to see you there as well. This evening, it is my honor to introduce Louis Masur, who is the Board of Governors Professor and Distinguished Professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University as the 2021 Robert Fortenbaugh Memorial Speaker. Although tonight's the first time I've ever met Lou, I'm familiar with the body of his scholarship. He has written on a range of diverse topics, from Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War to baseball and popular culture. But I really didn't know anything about what influenced Lou's approach to history. So I did exactly what I tell my students not to do. I turned to Google for some research assistance. So I was expecting to find interviews in which Lou spoke about the great scholars in Civil War history. Some of the scholars who spoke right here at the Fortenbaugh. The very first Fortenbaugh Lecture, as Bob Uliano told us tonight, was none other than Bruce Catton. But Lou didn't mention Bruce. He didn't mention Alan Nevins, John Hope Franklin, not even James McPherson. None of it in his online remarks. There was, however, one person who Lou consistently credited for shaping his approach to the past, and it is the New Jersey rocker, Bruce Springsteen. Lou has seen Bruce more than 100 times, and he has published a book on Springsteen entitled Runaway Dream, Born to Run, and Springsteen's American Vision. He also teaches a very popular class at Rutgers devoted entirely to the boss. So Lou, like his rocker hero, he appreciates the power of storytelling in connecting to wider audiences. Lou skillfully uses the techniques of fiction to translate specialized knowledge into compelling narratives that are filled with ordinary people struggling to pursue their dreams in a world that is mystifying, sad, and above all else, though, can be beautiful. You see that in two of Masur's or Lou's Civil War books, Lincoln's Last Speech and Lincoln's 100 Days. These are not traditional biographies, just focused on the president. Both of these books, they offer a window into a diverse cast of characters that help us understand the historical process in a traumatic Civil War. Lou's writings weave together the lyrical threads of his favorite Springsteen song. You can probably guess what it is, Born to Run. It is a song about longing, about escape, about a quest for freedom. Lou beautifully captures the struggles of ordinary people, striving, fighting to live out their competing visions of what it means to be an American. And not just what it means to be a New Jerseyan. And I should note here, I'm going to embarrass my wife, as I was working on this, my wife Beth is from New Jersey, I reminded her that in 1864, the great state of New Jersey voted for, not Abraham Lincoln, but for George B. McClellan. And my wife retorted very quickly, she said, yes, but New Jersey produced Bruce Springsteen. If every state was so fortunate to have a rock star, they could cleanse the state of its sins, but New Jersey has just that. Finally, Lou's teaching style draws its inspiration from the boss's incredible live performances. In the classroom, he's played Born to Run, scampering up and down the aisle, singing and yelling before a packed house of students. I don't think there will be any singing from Lou tonight, but I can assure you that he will give a dynamic talk. But Lou promises that his lecture on Abraham Lincoln and the problem of Reconstruction, it will not turn into a 3-hour show like a Springsteen concert. We welcome Lou Masur.
I could have sat and listened to more of that. That was great. It's such an honor to deliver the 59th Memorial Fortenbaugh Lecture and to look out upon a sea of faces and not a green dot at the top of my computer. This is really a special evening for many different reasons. I want to thank the members of the Fortenbaugh family who are here this evening, the many benefactors who have contributed to this, this occasion over the years. I'm also deeply indebted to Gettysburg College, Bob Uliani, for his remarks at dinner, to Dina Lowy and the incredible history department that is at Gettysburg College. Pete and I, as he said, just met, and I feel like we are brothers separated at birth. And so we spent a lot of time talking about rock and roll, less time talking about the Civil War, although here you go, Pete, I'm going to give you a trivia question to work on. And you can't Google this, you have to listen to the songs. What's the one Springsteen song that name checks the Civil War? That'll keep you busy for a while, all right? Maybe at the end this evening, I will reveal that. Pete, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for all you do for Civil War studies. Your work and the work of the Institute has been absolutely transformative. And I, too, want to express my thanks to Heather Miller, who's just, I literally would not be standing here tonight if not for the way in which she arranged the logistics. So it is truly an honor to be here to deliver this talk on Lincoln and the problem of Reconstruction. After Lincoln left this place on November 19th, he contracted varioid fever, a mild form of smallpox. The president, quite unwell, John Hay reported on November 26, 1863. His illness caused alarm among Republicans as well as Democrats. Even the New York World, a rabidly anti-administration Democratic paper, paused to comment, quote, "We believe we but echo the feeling of the whole country, without distinction of party, in sincerely hoping that the president will soon be restored to health and to strength." However it made him feel, the smallpox did not in any way impair Lincoln's famous sense of humor. He observed how since he had been president, he had always had a crowd of people asking him to give them something. Now, he quipped, he has something he can give them all. He joked as well about his appearance. The illness caused, smallpox, right, pustules, marks, to appear on his face. Dismissing the blisters, he joked, "There is one consolation about the matter. It cannot in the least disfigure me." I'm actually sort of obsessed with Lincoln's appearance. that, for all the decades I've been reading Lincoln and stuff about Lincoln, person after person commented on what he looked like, how striking it was. And part of his personality, his defense mechanisms, if you will, his ability to be self-deprecating about his looks is such a critical part to understanding him. There's this famous moment, Walt Whitman, who volunteers at Armory Hospital in Washington during the war, he writes a letter home to his mother. He says, "I see the president nearly every day. He is like a Hoosier Michelangelo, so awful ugly, he's nearly beautiful." Well, I think it's important to understand that is a fundamental part, in some ways, of Lincoln's personality, his awareness that people perceived him in this way and his response. While recuperating, he worked on his annual message. The first part reviewed the expected litany of topics: foreign relations, the operations of the Treasury, the conditions of the Army and Navy, the status of the territories, the settlement of public lands. It had been a remarkable year, begun with the Emancipation Proclamation and authorization of the enlistment of black troops. Major military victories had come during the summer, of course. The crisis which threatened to divide the friends of the Union is past, Lincoln declared. There was now a new reckoning. Whatever attention was paid to the first part of that message, it was the second part that mattered most. Here, Lincoln provided rationale for the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction that accompanied the message on December 8th. It was Lincoln's fullest expression of his ideas on Reconstruction up to that point, but not his first. John Hay explained, important as are the topics in which Mr. Lincoln's duty to lay before Congress in the earlier part of his message, the vital interest of that document is to be found in that concluding portion, which is in fact addressed by the president not only to Congress, but to the nation, and to the disloyal as well as the true. According to Hay, Lincoln considered the restoration of the Union the greatest question ever presented to practical statesmanship. From the start of the war, Lincoln thought about Reconstruction, not only as an end, but as a means toward an end. He knew that if any of the 11 states in secession could be restored to the Union while the war raged, it would make Confederate success that much more unlikely. We often think of Reconstruction as the period following the war, or as beginning in 1863 with Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. But for Lincoln, ending the war and reconstructing the Union were connected from the start. He admitted as much in what would turn out to be his final speech. Delivered on April 11th, 1865, he told the crowd, the reinauguration of the national authority, Reconstruction, which has had a large share of thought from the first, is pressed much more closely upon our attention. This evening, I'd like to focus on Lincoln's ideas about Reconstruction. While some at the time, and historians since, have distinguished between such words as reunion, restoration, Reconstruction, Lincoln used the terms interchangeably, and in fact, he had very little patience for political theorizing about the status of the states in secession, whether they had committed suicide, state suicide, or whether they had been reduced to territories. I mean, all of that he found tedious, and he dismissed it as a pernicious abstraction. It's also worth noting that this word, Reconstruction, had a very different meaning before Lincoln's inauguration. Then, it was used to refer to remaking the Constitution through amendments to protect slavery. In other words, reconstructing the nation to appease the secessionists, not our sense of reconstructing the nation once the war began. In an editorial entitled Reconstruction Not Practicable, the Chicago Tribune denounced the pretense that reconstruction of the Union on terms more satisfactory to the South as a bold and shallow lie. The present Union is the only one possible between the free and slave states. Lincoln, of course, made it clear time and again that he would not support a constitutional amendment that protected slavery by restoring and extending the Masur Compromise line to the Pacific. He famously wrote Lyman Trumbull, "Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. If there be, all our labor is lost, and ere long must be done again. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter. All compromise measures failed, and in his inaugural address, Lincoln sought to discuss a peaceful solution to the problem of secession. He assured Southerners he had no intention to interfere directly or indirectly with slavery where it existed. He proceeded to deny any constitutional grounds for secession. The union of these states is perpetual, he insisted. No state, upon its own mere notion, can lawfully get out of the union. The union is unbroken. Secession, he observed, is the essence of anarchy. And his administration would continue to execute the laws of the United States. There would be no violence unless, quote, it be forced upon the national authority. Lincoln's inaugural is seldom read for insights into his approach to restoring the Union, but several aspects of the address are telling. Most significant is the idea of the indissoluble Union. If the Confederate States never left because secession was unconstitutional, then the residents of those states were still entitled to their rights as citizens, even though they were in rebellion. Until 1863, that included their right to slaves. Not talking tonight about emancipation, but in my book, Lincoln's 100 Days, right, that's the issue. I mean, what takes him so long, right? It drives the radical Republicans absolutely bonkers that he doesn't act against slavery when the war begins. Well, one of the reasons why he doesn't is this theory that if secession is the essence of anarchy, if it's unconstitutional, then they still maintain their rights to slaves. It takes him time to get to the point where he understands that he can act. The states would resume their place through the establishment of legitimate state governments by loyal citizens. When toward the end of the inaugural, Lincoln called upon his countrymen to think calmly and well upon this whole subject, he was expressing a central element of his temperament. Lincoln was a patient man whose careful deliberations often infuriated others, who thought he was stubborn and obdurate, but by nature, he was a gradualist, willing to let time itself act as the central agent of change. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time, he advised. This, too, would characterize his approach to Reconstruction, which would evolve, but only after he allowed various initiatives to run their course. His first actions, if you will, toward Reconstruction included signing the bill that admitted West Virginia as a state, and between March and November 1862, appointing military governors in Tennessee, North Carolina, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Now, with respect to West Virginia, Lincoln was uncertain about the constitutionality of that bill. These portion of the state that had broken off, that had in effect seceded. He asked his cabinet for their opinions. They divided evenly on the question. They each wrote back their own opinions on it. And finally, on December 31st, 1862, Lincoln decided in favor of West Virginia statehood. With an eye toward affirming the measure's constitutionality, he asked, can this government stand if it indulges constitutional constructions by which men in open rebellion against it are to be accounted man for man, the equals of those who maintain their loyalty to it? There were also arguments out of expediency. He argued that the expediency argument depended on whether the act would tend to more strongly lead to the restoration of national authority throughout the Union, and he believed that it would. So there was a constitutional argument, there was an expediency argument. But what about those who said that by admitting West Virginia, the government was in effect promoting secession, the very thing that Lincoln said was the essence of anarchy, was unconstitutional? Well, he said, if we call it by that name, there's still a difference between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. I love that. The lawyer being able to sort of lime this distinction in order to justify supporting admitting West Virginia as a state. With respect to military governors, the specific wording of the commissions varied, but their responsibility was to reestablish the authority of the federal government, provide the means of maintaining peace and security to the loyal inhabitants until they shall be able to establish a civil government in conformity with the Constitution of the United States. And the results all varied, and they varied widely depending upon a variety of factors, most significantly military success. You need to have military success in order to begin to implement this strategy of having elections and restoring the state to its proper relationship to the government, the actions of the individual military governor, the nature and extent of Southern Unionism. But Lincoln's intentions were clear, and the story of the military governors, particularly in Tennessee and Louisiana, as we'll see, is pivotal to understanding his approach to wartime Reconstruction. In Tennessee, he appointed Andrew Johnson the military governor, and he pressed him to hold elections. This cartoon, of course, appears after the election of 1864, but this is the beginning of this relationship, this belief that Andrew Johnson was going to be critical to helping in the process of Reconstruction. The rail splitter at work repairing the Union, and there's Johnson on top, sort of trying to stitch it together, and Lincoln saying, this is 1864, that we're almost there. Well, Lincoln says to Johnson, if we could somehow get a vote of the people of Tennessee and have it result properly, it would be worth more to us than a battle gained. Wartime Reconstruction, Lincoln understood, was a means of hastening victory. How long before we can get such a vote? He asked on July 3rd, 1862. So eager was Lincoln for elections and not to alienate the Tennessee Unionists, he exempted Tennessee from the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. After Johnson converted to emancipation, Lincoln wrote on September 11th, 1863, I see that you have declared in favor of emancipation in Tennessee, for which may God bless you. Get emancipation into your state government constitution, and there will be no such word as fail in your case. Lincoln again pressed for elections. This was the key. And he advised Johnson, let Reconstruction be the work of such men only as can be trusted for the Union. Still, prior to his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, there had been no movement toward elections. Elsewhere, no progress occurred in reestablishing federal authority, holding elections, not in North Carolina, a little bit later on in Arkansas, not in Texas, but Louisiana. Louisiana would preoccupy Lincoln from the moment of the Union victory in New Orleans on April 28, 1862, to his final speech in 1865. He repeatedly pressed for elections and wrote letters imploring Louisiana Unionists that if they wish protection of person and property, they have but reach forth their hands and take it. Let them in good faith re-inaugurate the national authority. He uses that phrase over and over again. And set up a state government conforming thereto to the Constitution. As to slavery, the longer they waited, the less likely it would be they would hold on to their property. Broken eggs cannot be mended, he warned. Louisiana has nothing to do now but take her place in the Union as it was, barring the already broken eggs. You'll see he comes back to a different egg metaphor later on. The sooner she does so, the smaller will be the amount of which will need mending. This was all, of course, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Those eggs, if those eggs are enslavement, are broken for good after January 1st, 1863. On August 5th, 1863, he wrote to Nathaniel Banks to specify what he would like to see accomplished in Louisiana. I would be glad for her to make a new constitution, recognizing the Emancipation Proclamation and adopting emancipation in those parts of the states where the proclamation does not apply. Looking beyond political reconstruction, he then turned to the question that was only beginning to draw attention. How would emancipation alter social relationships between blacks and whites? While she is at it, Lincoln observed, I think it would not be objectionable, that construction, that use of the negative. We'll see that again, time and again. I think it would not be objectionable for her to adopt some practical system by which the two races could gradually live themselves out of their old relation to each other and both come out better prepared for the new. I think about that sentence a lot, kind of like a Zen koan, right? What does that mean to gradually live yourself out of an old relationship to one another? And he didn't make it clear what he meant. Perhaps he meant new wage labor relationships. It certainly meant education for black children. What was needed to begin the process was the election of delegates to a constitutional convention. How Louisiana and other states could proceed was outlined, of course, in his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, issued on December 8th, 1863. In that proclamation, Lincoln offered full pardon to persons who have directly or by implication participated in the existing rebellion. There were, to be sure, several categories of exceptions: Confederate civil or diplomatic officers, all who left seats in Congress or judicial stations to aid in the rebellion, officers above the rank of colonel in the Army and lieutenant in the Navy, anyone who treated prisoners of war, white or black, unlawfully. The pardon would be granted with restoration of all rights of property except to slaves, to persons who took an oath to faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution, and abide by and faithfully support all acts of Congress passed during the existing rebellion with reference to slaves, as well as all proclamations of the president made, as long as, of course, the Supreme Court didn't overturn them. Lincoln's proclamation also declared that whenever a number of persons, not less than 1/10 in number, cast the presidential election of 1860 took an oath to reestablish a state government which shall be Republican, small r Republican, that government shall be recognized as the true government of the state and receive the full benefits provided by the Constitution. Toward that end, Lincoln relied on double negatives, passive voice, third person, to make two additional important points. Any plans with respect to the freed people that, quote, shall recognize and declare their permanent freedom, provide for their education, and which may yet be consistent as a temporary arrangement with their present condition as a laboring, landless, and homeless class will not be objected to by the national executive. There's a lot of talk afterwards among abolitionists and others. Oh, what is he talking about? What does he mean? Is he going to allow some other form of serfdom to occur? Will not be objected to. Finally, the proclamation presents a mode whereby national authority and loyal state governments can be reestablished. While the mode presented is the best the executive can suggest, with his present impressions, Lincoln concluded, it would not be understood that no other possible mode would be accepted. It would not be understood that no other possible mode would be accepted. The White House couldn't have been happier with the response. Hay wrote about it effusively. Whatever may be the results of the verdict of history, the immediate effect of this paper is something wonderful. I have never seen such effect produced by a public document. Men acted as if the millennium had come. Zachariah Chandler was delighted. Charles Sumner was beaming, while at the other political poll, James Dixon and Reverend Johnson said it was highly satisfactory. Henry Wilson came to me, laying his broad arms on my shoulder, said, "The president has struck another great blow. Tell him from me, God bless him." The New York Times proclaimed Abraham Lincoln is one of the few men who believes that words stand for something. He economizes them accordingly. The process of Reconstruction, as the president put it, is simple yet perfectly effective. He gives no countenance to the project which has been so vehemently advocated of reducing the redeemed states to a territorial condition. A month later, the paper tied Lincoln's plan to his reelection. Unquestionably, one of the strongest causes of the popular manifestations of the reelection of Lincoln is the fact that he most directly represents an acceptable policy in regard to Reconstruction. Lincoln had Union forces distribute copies of the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction and said he was anxious to have it distributed even within enemy lines, determined to demonstrate the effectiveness of his policy by showing that significant numbers of Southerners sought pardons. This is part of his ongoing belief system in Southern Unionism, just allowing an opportunity to come forward. Union troops were so effective at distributing the proclamation that General James Longstreet wrote in protest to General John G. Foster, who commanded Union forces in Knoxville. "I find the proclamation of President Lincoln of the 6th of December last in circulation in handbills among our soldiers," reported Longstreet. "The immediate object of this circulation appears to be to induce our soldiers to quit our ranks and to take the oath of allegiance to the United States government." Longstreet said it was improper to communicate with the soldiers directly, and that those likely to respond are of such a debased character, they're not going to do you any good anyhow. Well, Forster could not resist some sarcasm in his response. He writes back and says to Longstreet, "I accept your suggestion that it would have been more courteous to have sent these documents to you for circulation. And I embrace with pleasure the opportunity thus afforded to enclose to you 20 copies of each of these documents. And I rely upon your generosity and desire for peace to give publicity to the same among your officers and men." Lincoln didn't know about this. Lincoln first saw the correspondence reprinted in newspapers. And he says to Forster, "Is a supposed correspondence between General Longstreet and yourself about the Amnesty Proclamation, which is now in the papers, genuine?" And Forster responded that it was. Through 1864, incremental steps toward elections in Louisiana and Arkansas were taking place. But despite enthusiasm for the proclamation across the Republican Party, Congress, of course, decided it had its own ideas about how to proceed. In a tempestuous legislative session, Congressmen offered various proposals on how to organize state governments and readmit them to the Union. Henry Dawes observed, "Everybody abounds in schemes for settling the troubles in the rebel states, and at least 6 plans a day are offered in the House in the shape of a bill." Well, the bill that would eventually emerge on July 2nd, the Wade-Davis bill, was a bill, quote, "to guarantee to certain states whose governments have been usurped or overthrown a Republican form of government." The title itself incorporated a theory of secession whereby the states had not committed suicide or been conquered. They were still in the Union, but their governments had been subverted. The final bill called for the appointment by the president with Senate consent of a provisional governor for each state in rebellion. Once military resistance had been suppressed, all white male citizens would be enrolled and asked to swear an oath to support the Constitution. If 50% of them took an oath, as opposed to the 10% under Lincoln's plan, the provisional governor would call a constitutional convention. Only those who could take the ironclad oath adopted by Congress on July 2nd, 1862, could vote. That disqualified persons who had held any office, civil or military, state or Confederate, during the war, or voluntarily bore arms against the United States. It mandated that any new constitution declare slavery is forever prohibited, repudiate the Confederate debt, and barred from voting or serving as governor anyone who held a civil or military position. In certain ways, it actually was a moderate plan. Indeed, Pennsylvania's William Kelly, a friend and loyal, though sometimes critical, supporter of Lincoln, complained the bill is drawn rather too largely from the president's plan. It did not enfranchise blacks, which has been discussed at this point by some privately. It did not adopt a theory of territorialization. At first, it even incorporated Lincoln's 10% plan, but an amendment created the distinction from 10 to 50%. The change came out of congressional concern for majority rule. As Davis put it, 1/10 should not control 9/10. Whatever the details, the bill in Congress threatened the progress made under Lincoln's proclamation. It encapsulated Davis's belief that, quote, "is the exclusive prerogative of Congress and not the president, to determine what is and what is not the established government of the state." Furthermore, the bill would delay Reconstruction until after the rebellion had ended. It's not safe, Davis warned, to provide vast authority of state governments to the doubtful loyalty of the rebel states. If Lincoln signed the measure, the result would have been the abandonment of any progress already made, especially in Louisiana and Arkansas, and a repudiation of his belief that establishing loyal state governments while the war was going on would hasten the end of the rebellion. It could have meant there would be no Reconstruction until the war was over. Lincoln received the bill 2 days before Congress adjourned, and he killed it by deciding not to sign it, a pocket veto. Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan asked if the bill was signed. He was hovering around. Told no, he spoke with Lincoln, who, according to Hayes, said, "This bill was placed before me a few minutes before Congress adjourns. It is a matter of too much importance to be swallowed in that way." Given the consternation that his actions caused many Republicans, perhaps hoping to unify the party as it approached the November election, Lincoln decided a few days later to issue a proclamation explaining why he didn't sign it, using for the first time this phrase, which we'll hear again, proper practical relation, to describe the objective of restoring states in rebellion to the Union, Lincoln said he was unprepared by a formal approval of the bill to be inflexibly committed to any single plan. Moreover, he was unprepared to set aside the free state constitutions adopted in Louisiana and Arkansas. Furthermore, he did not believe Congress had, quote, a constitutional competency to abolish slavery in the states, but was hoping for a constitutional amendment that would do so. And yet he declared, I am fully satisfied with the system for restoration contained in the bill as one very proper plan for the loyal people of any state choosing to adopt it. Well, with that sentence, Lincoln sounded generous and accommodating, but he knew, of course, that the concession had no meaning. What state would choose sterner measures, an ironclad oath and majority requirement, offered by Congress when the president's plan held out less demanding terms? Wade and Davis were outraged. Through the pages of the New York Tribune, they issued a manifesto that denounced Lincoln's pocket veto and proclamation with an explanation as a defeat of the will of the people. It was the executive perversion of the Constitution. They denounced the new government in Louisiana and Arkansas as shadow governments that exist as mere creatures of his will. The rejection of representatives elected from those states meant the existence of state government is conclusively rejected and denied. By killing the bill, Lincoln holds the electoral votes of the rebel states at the dictation of his personal ambition, they said. His claim that Congress could not act against slavery was unintelligible, and his final concession that the plan was proper as a system of restoration was a studied outrage on the legislative authority of the people. He defeats the law and then proposes to act when congressional consultation on a congressional plan. The authority of Congress is paramount, must be respected. If not, they warned, remedies existed, i.e. impeachment, for these usurpations. Wade and Davis devoted a large portion to condemning Reconstruction in Louisiana, wartime Reconstruction in Louisiana. They claimed elections were held under martial law, that the Union controlled only 11 out of 48 parishes, that of the 11,000 votes cast, at least 4,000 they suspected came from Union soldiers stationed there. The appointment of Michael Hahn as provisional governor, vested with the power of a military governor, was a farce whereby Lincoln made him dictator of Louisiana without authorization or Senate consent. But if Wade and Davis believed their actions would give Lincoln pause on Reconstruction, they were mistaken. 4 days after they issued their manifesto, Lincoln wrote to Banks to congratulate him on the adoption of a new Louisiana Constitution and to pledge support for its ratification. A few months earlier, he had written Michael Hahn, the newly elected governor, and he suggested privately that some black men be given the right to vote. Reconstruction in Louisiana would remain a battleground between the president and Congress. Of course, none of this would have mattered had he not been reelected. Some commentators understood what was at stake. One writer framed it this way: yet a few days and it will be decided whether the people of the United States shall condemn their own conduct by cashiering an administration which they call upon to make war on the rebellious slaveholders of the South, or support that administration in the strenuous endeavors which it is making to effect the reconstruction of the Republic and the destruction of slavery. Lincoln, of course, won a resounding victory, and he began working on his annual message to Congress. The subject of Reconstruction and how it should be effected is the most important theme, reported Gideon Wells, after hearing a draft of it on November 25th. And in that message, Lincoln talked about Reconstruction in terms of important steps to be taken, to the effect of molding society for the durability of the Union. He noted the newly organized state governments with free constitutions. He anticipated the same for Tennessee. He observed that the border states of Masur and Kentucky were already moving toward emancipation. Abolition had taken effect in Maryland on November 1st, and the state was, quote, secure to liberty and union for all the future. He noted in that message that a year had passed since the proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And while many white Southerners had taken advantage of the offer, he affirmed that the door was still open. But he warned that the time will come when the public shall demand that it be closed, when more rigorous measures shall be adopted. Lincoln did not specify what those measures might entail, but the sentiment no doubt pleased radicals who all along felt he had been too lenient toward the rebels. He closed by reasserting his commitment to emancipation in the strongest possible terms. I retract nothing heretofore said as to slavery. If the people should, by whatever mode or means, make it an executive duty to re-enslave such persons, another, not I, must be the instrument to perform it. He would resign rather than restore slavery. As for peace, he explained in his final sentence there was only one condition. The war will cease on the part of the government when it shall have ceased on the part of those who began it. The message was applauded after being read by the clerk. Thaddeus Stevens pronounced in Congress, there never was a day since Abraham Lincoln was elected president that he stood so high or deserved to stand so high in the estimation of the people as at this moment. The good feeling, of course, did not last. Efforts in Congress to pass a Reconstruction bill collapsed, and so with it, the last chance for recognition of Louisiana when both houses of Congress decided not to seat any members from the state. On February 27th, Zachariah Chandler wrote his wife, "We killed the Louisiana bill yesterday. So dead it will not pass this session." But Lincoln would not abandon Louisiana. Soon enough, Congress would be out of session, the rebellion over, and Lincoln could take the case of Louisiana directly to the people. Everyone knew that his second inaugural would be brief. Newspapers informed the public it is the briefest inaugural ever written, Lincoln says, and he hopes that it will not be announced the worst. A gentleman to whom it has been read says it will not occupy more than 6 or 7 minutes in its delivery, reported one journalist, and that it will very generally be endorsed as the best inaugural address ever made. He was strikingly reminded of the president's brief but famous Gettysburg speech while listening to it. Lincoln said that God willed this terrible war for the sin of slavery, and the war would continue until the mighty scourge is ended. It will continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. It was an astonishing judgment, retributive, vengeful, unforgiving. Lincoln quoted from Psalm 19, "The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." But if the inaugural struck an Old Testament note, its tune was New Testament. The singular final sentence expresses Lincoln's essence. The phrase, "with malice toward none, with charity for all," is much an articulation of how he would treat the rebels once they lay down their arms and return to the Union as a philosophy of life. Even more strongly, he paraphrased Matthew 7. "Judge not that we not be judged." Magnanimity, generosity, forgiveness would guide Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction. Well, not everyone was pleased with that. Some radicals, most of all, Sumner snorted at Lincoln's tenderness and constantly repeating, "Judge not that we not be judged." There's a letter that he writes to Chase in which you can also hear him mocking the president for repeating this time and time again. Marquis de Chabrol, a French journalist visiting Washington, describes Sumner in a letter home written on February 27, 1865. He said, "Sumner's opinions are so radical that they are far in advance of actual possibility. Revolution, confiscation, violent means of any sort, forced appropriation of slaveholders, everything appears to him legitimate and necessary in order to arrive at his objective. Any opposition to his principles constitute moral turpitude, and he hates turpitude the way God hates sin." Well, Lincoln was exhausted, and he left Washington for City Point on March 23rd to meet with Grant. Mary Todd and Tad were part of the presidential party. Time and again on that trip, he repeated his desire for a policy based on mercy and forgiveness. This print shows Lincoln and Tad when they arrived in Richmond, and they took the walk, unexpected, up to Jefferson Davis's, the Confederate White House, Jefferson Davis's mansion. People, of course, stormed out into the streets. No one really knew what was going on. At one point, General Godfrey Weitzel, who commanded Union forces in Richmond after the city fell on April 3rd, recalled a conversation about how to treat the conquered rebels. "The pith of his answers," wrote Weitzel, "was that he did not wish to give me any orders on that subject, But as he expressed it, if I were in your place, I'd let him up easy. Let him up easy. Chambrone was among the travel party with Lincoln for part of the time at City Point. And the day after arriving back in Washington, he reported it was impossible to discover in Lincoln any thought of revenge or feeling of bitterness toward the vanquished. Whenever anyone spoke of reprisal, he became impatient. Pardon appeared to him an absolute necessity. Never did clemency suggest itself more naturally to a victorious chief. Someone said that Davis's capture was possible and that he must be hanged. Lincoln replied very calmly by repeating the phrase he had used in his inaugural, "Let us judge not, that we not be judged." No doubt Grant's generous terms at Appomattox jibed with Lincoln's wishes. He learned of the surrender on his return to Washington the evening of April 9th. On April 10th, crowds gathered around the president's house. They called on him to speak. He knew that what he was going to say was perhaps the most important, momentous speech of the entire war. And he delayed. At one point, he saw a band, and he asked them to strike up a song. You all know what song he asked them to strike up? Dixie, indeed. He joked that the Union would reappropriate it as a captured prize of war. Of course, we have to read it as a conciliatory gesture to the defeated South. One paper noted the president understands well the power of national songs, and what is better, he uses it at the right time and for a good purpose. Finally, on the evening of April 11th, Lincoln appeared. He opened with the sentence, "We meet this evening, not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart." It's such classic Lincoln. Not in sorrow, again, that negative. This man who knew so much suffering, so much pain, who suffered from what everyone described as melancholia, as what was known as the hypos, right, a form of depression. This man who carried the burden of the war on his shoulders for 4 years, all of those deaths, whose own son, Willie, died in the White House. The sorrow had been insurmountable, but at last we meet not in sorrow, but gladness of heart. We're not happy. We're not overjoyed. We're not exultant. Too much pain, too much suffering, too much loss, but a kind of swelling up. He went on to say, "We, the loyal people, differ among ourselves as to the mode, manner, of means of Reconstruction." And then he went into a speech that I argue in my book. He pulled out of his pigeonhole from back in February. The speech is really interesting. Unfortunately, the manuscript is in private hands, one of the most important Lincoln documents in private hands. But I was able to see a sort of holograph of it in the Library of Congress, and you could see that the first 2 pages, which he clearly wrote that day or that evening, are different than the pages that follow. So I argue that the pages that follow was his attempt to again make the case for Louisiana. And he rejected any ideas about the status of seceded states. He used the phrase proper practical relation 5 times to describe how it is that he thought those states should be brought back into the Union. Of course, they had never left, but they need to be brought back into this proper practical relation. Now he asked the American Republic, can Louisiana be brought into proper practical relation with the Union sooner by sustaining or by discarding her new state government? It was a matter of common sense. 12,000 voters had done the work of organizing a loyal state government, adopting a constitution that abolished slavery, and empowering the legislature to bestow the vote on black men. He suggested that the new state government is only what it should be as the egg is to the fowl, and asked whether we shall sooner have the fowl by hatching the egg or by smashing it. Again, it's Lincoln's ability to speak to the people, to use metaphors of common understanding. Of course, some commentators wrote, yeah, but what if the eggs are rotten? Shouldn't we smash them then? And he again asked the question, can Louisiana be brought into proper practical relation with the Union sooner by sustaining or by discarding her new state government? And then he went somewhere that he had never publicly gone before. He called for giving the right to vote to black men who served and those who were educated. Suffrage. He had expressed the view privately. There had been much talk about this. Of course, for Lincoln, the war was many things. It was always, most of all, a war about democracy, right? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. And he understood the importance of the right to vote for these newly freed persons in order to elect representatives who are going to protect and defend their interests. Now, I'm not naive about this, right? There's a certain expediency as well. Take a guess which political party these black men are going to vote for if given the right to vote, and indeed, 99% probably vote Republican until the era of Roosevelt, when they famously turned Lincoln's portrait to the wall. He ended again by insisting on the importance of flexibility. He acknowledged that the situation was fluid, and he may make some new announcement when satisfied that action will be proper. John Wilkes Booth was among the crowd that heard the speech. He turned to Lewis Powell and he said, that's the last speech he will ever give. And while we don't often think of Lincoln as a martyr to civil rights to the extent that it was that speech and the endorsement of black voting rights that precipitated the action 3 days later, perhaps it's something that we should consider. That Good Friday afternoon, he took a carriage ride with Mary Todd. He told her from a letter she wrote later, I consider this day the war has come to a close. He was probably happy that afternoon, happier than he'd been in a long time. They talked about plans for after his second term was concluded. He said he heard California was a beautiful state he always wanted to visit, and perhaps they would go there. But of course, it was not to be. Through it all, he had never renounced the areas in rebellion. Twice in his last speech, he referred to the seceded states as so-called, the so-called seceded states. There were no seceded states. There never were. He held fast to the doctrine he proclaimed in his first inaugural. The central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. And in contemplation of a universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. From the start of the war, he sought to restore proper practical relations with those states, both as a means of helping to terminate the rebellion and with an eye toward the ultimate end of reunifying the nation. Guided by principles of mercy and practicality, he was prepared to advance his plans for reunion, restoration, reconstruction, interchangeable words for his purposes. Soon, perhaps, he would have another announcement to make. But he would not be given that chance. Now you are thinking, and we're going to have time after this talk, which will end in a few minutes, for questions and answers, so begin giving some thought to those. I think this is the first time that the Fortenbaugh Lecture is going to have questions and answers at the end. But let me anticipate one of them, not preempt it, but anticipate. What if Lincoln had lived? It comes naturally, the question, of course. Counterfactuals can be very useful devices, hypotheticals, for thinking about, clarifying certain issues. And I thought a lot about it when I wrote this. And here's one of the things that I had to say. All that could be said with certainty on the question of what if Lincoln had lived concerns character, not policy. And Lincoln's character did not allow politics to become personal. During the war, his disagreements with the radicals never turned malicious. He was not given to personal resentments. Neither was he doctrinaire. He recognized there were plans other than his worth considering, and he said so repeatedly. Time and again, he changed his mind. He altered his position. there's every reason to believe that after the war, he would have moved the nation toward a political reconstruction that did not forsake Southern loyalists and a social reconstruction that may not have provided the freedmen with all that the radicals envisioned, but would have afforded more by way of government support and protection than Southern blacks ended up receiving. Frederick Douglass, for one, mourned deeply the loss of Lincoln to lead the nation to Reconstruction. He said this, and I think about this line a lot as well. Had Mr. Lincoln lived, we might have looked for still greater progress. Learning wisdom from war, he would have learned more from peace. I think about that a lot. Having learned wisdom from war, he would have learned more from peace. Whoever else has cause to mourn the loss of Abraham Lincoln, to the colored people of this country, his death is an unspeakable calamity. I want to close by talking for a moment about W.E.B. Du Bois and his comments about Lincoln. Du Bois, of course, is one of the most famous black intellectuals, writers, the first black man to receive a PhD from Harvard University, founder of the NAACP, editor of the Crisis magazine, the author of The Souls of Black Folk, one of the most penetrating and important books ever written about the meaning of being black in America. And Du Bois, like so many of us, was thinking really hard about this guy, about what he meant, about why we're so attracted to him. And at the time of the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, here's what he had to say. He said, I love him, not because he was perfect, but because he was not, and yet he triumphed. Full of illegitimate children. The world is full of people who are educated in the gutter. The world is full of those born hating and despising their fellows. To these I love to say, do you see this man? He was one of you, but he became Abraham Lincoln. Thank you so much. Either threatened or offered. There is an opportunity now for some questions and answers. I hope you will take us up on that. I think it's a great opportunity. I also very much hope that some of the students here will ask a question. I want to say this. I didn't get to say this in my thank yous, but I had lunch this afternoon with a group of students. And my goodness, they are remarkable. And I wanted to share with them and all of you this moment in Lincoln's life. Right, when he ran for president, he filled out a questionnaire. And in that questionnaire, he just had to answer some questions. And it said, born February 12th, 1809, Hardin County, Kentucky. Education, defective. Well, I assure you guys, your education is clearly here not defective. And that dream of education, that use of education, as that path of upward mobility, it's what led Lincoln to where he got, and it's what's going to lead you guys to where you're headed. So I just wanted to tell you that and to thank you guys for lunch this afternoon and for other opportunities we've had to talk. Now I've really put you on the spot to ask a good question, though. Anyway, are there any questions? I see a hand over here. Right.
And I'd also like to have your feelings about how Thaddeus Stevens essentially saved the country after Lincoln's assassination by excluding Southern representatives from Congress.
So if you guys heard, the question basically is about Andrew Johnson. And part of the response is this, and I don't mean it glibly, right? But we live life forward, we understand it backward. And at the moment that Johnson was the choice, no one anticipated what was going to be. And it's really important always to keep that in mind, right? That's part of the challenge of being a historian, right, is to think about that. As I mentioned, right, he's chosen for a variety of reasons. The work he does in Tennessee, the belief it's going to help him win the election, that he had made this commitment to anti-slavery. Nobody knew or anticipated that once he took office, nobody anticipated, of course, that Lincoln would be assassinated. So no one thought he was going to be president. So it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. Once he became the sort of executive he became, yeah, then I agree with you completely, right? I mean, Stevens and Sumner and the radicals are critical. The other thing that's critical, of course, is Johnson's actions forced the moderates left, right? Part of Lincoln's genius as a politician, as I sort of suggested, was his ability to sort of navigate between the left side of the party, the moderates, and he had Democrats on the other side. Once Johnson takes the actions he takes, then it becomes clear-cut that it's going to be a unified sort of Congress against. But yeah, it's a remarkable moment in American history. Some of my colleagues in the audience know much more about this than I do. But to think that Alexander Stephens was reelected to Congress in December of 1865, right? And but for, as you point out, the radicals, I mean, might have been seated. Of course, they take the actions that they take, and we get where we're going. So I hope that sort of partially addresses it. Other questions? Where are one of my students? There we go.
Thank you. I have a question regarding Reconstruction and the economic aspect of it. Often we think of the slave labor system of the South and how that sort of kept them down and perpetuated the system. But again, wage labor in the North through textile factories did keep the cotton slave system going. So I'm wondering, did Lincoln ever consider that aspect in Reconstruction and reconstructing the Northern economic structure to make it possible to really get rid of the system at hand?
To get rid of which system?
Slavery.
I mean, slavery's gotten rid of, right? The problem is, what is the transition from slavery to going to be, and what's that economic relationship going to look like? I mean, wage labor is the thing, right? I mean, the sort of foundation of the Republican Party. I don't have to tell you all this, right? Free labor, free men, free soil. There's a sort of model there and a vision, right? As Lincoln said over and over again, right? We were talking a little bit at dinner about the American dream. I mean, that idea of the penniless beggar who works hard and then achieves something and hire somebody else. I mean, that's that classic sort of vision. But what's that going to look like in the South? How do you transition from a system of slavery to a system of wage labor when you have slaveholders who, could not accept the end of, I mean, some did, right? And some didn't. I mean, Leon Litwack's Been in the Storm So Long remains a great book about that moment and what took place. I mean, that's part of what bedevils us now when we ask the sort of counterfactual. Could it have been different? What would have been needed for it to have been different? I mean, land was critical, right? It's a Southern agricultural society, and without the redistribution of land so that these men can labor as farmers and earn a living, right? And the emergence of sharecropping becomes more pernicious in lots of ways than other forms of, than other institutions. I don't know what the answer is. Some of us talked about it at lunch today, right? And talked about, I know they've discussed it in Professor Carmichael's sort of course, right? I mean, what are the options? And what's the extreme option? The extreme option is trials for treason, disfranchisement, confiscation of estates, right? Some of the visions that the radical purpose wanted. But it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen under Lincoln because I already made the argument. Lincoln thought differently about the problem. So if that wasn't going to happen, what are the kinds of things that might have helped to make the change? I still think whether with Lincoln or not, we get the 14th and 15th Amendments, and as we know, that becomes absolutely critical to the history and the legacy of Reconstruction. But it's a great question. Thank you for it. Yes, go ahead.
At what point do you think that hypotheticals, like from a useful tool, at what point do you think they stop being a useful tool and just discrediting the history that did happen? Yeah,
that's a great question. God, you guys are good. In my concise Civil War, I quote Cormac McCarthy at the beginning, right? The novelist who, in All the Pretty Things, says, there are no might have beens. Never was, never were, right? Never will be. And we have to keep that in mind. There are no might have beens. But on the other hand, I do think it's a useful intellectual tool to sort of clarify the issues, right? Of the what might have beens. I mean, nothing has greater contingency, of course, than the Civil War. And you all know that. I mean, battle to battle, minute to minute, something could have gone the other way that would have changed the outcome of history. And at one point, that's kind of terrorizing to think about. But in other ways, it's also liberating. I mean, but this is what happened, and then what is going to follow from that? What are the options, and what are the choices that get made? You know, one of the reasons why I love Lincoln so much, and I do, when I lecture around the country on Lincoln, I open by saying I love Abraham Lincoln, and I'm unapologetic about that, is that that ability to think through things and to change his mind over time. It's just the greatest quality, right? It's remarkable. I mean, this is the guy who, in 1854 in the Peoria speech, said, "I do not believe in the political and social equality of blacks." In his last public speech, he's endorsing giving them the right to vote. To think, right? To think through issues and to be willing to change your mind and not be wedded to doctrine is, to me, part of the story of his greatness. But so I think it's a useful tool. Keep using it. The other thing is an aphorism that I happen to like. The only thing certain is the future, because the past is constantly changing. Think about that. And it is, because the past is not, right, this thing that we reconstruct objectively and we know what happened, right? It's about points of view, it's about stories, it's about perspectives, it's about evidence. And we can tell multiple stories, and we have to suss through those stories to decide which one at any given time carries the most valence, the most weight. How about one more question? Anybody else? I see a hand. Is there a hand back there in the middle? Yes. Is that you? Go ahead. Yes, in the white. Wait, microphone coming.
Okay, see, I got two. I guess I'll pick one. So Lincoln clearly valued the Constitution and always tried to justify the actions that he was taking by convincing himself what he was doing was not only allowed by the Constitution, but it is something that he was mandated to do in order to uphold it. So how did Lincoln factor in the constitutionality of his actions while he was taking them? Because I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that some of them maybe weren't. Yeah,
it's a fantastic question. You know, and this is very much in the air these days. You know, Noah Feldman just wrote a book about Lincoln and the Constitution. And if you read Sean Walentz's review of it, you know, this whole argument about Lincoln's idea of the anti-slavery Constitution and whether or not the Constitution is anti-slavery or not is a hot topic in American history right now. But as Lincoln said time and again, I mean, he was an adherent to the Constitution, but he also understood that in a time of war, certain things were necessary that might not be constitutional, but to preserve the nation took precedence. And this is where we can argue, right? His record on civil liberties becomes problematic at points. But his emphasis was that his responsibility at all costs was to find a way to save the Union. It's the reason why, though, you know, his adherence to the Constitution is why he doesn't act against slavery, because he doesn't feel as president has the power to do so, right? This is a commonplace, but you may not all know it. So when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, I mean, he's acting as commander-in-chief, right? He's acting as a military necessity, and he's been given an opinion that under those terms, he can act to free those slaves, and the rationale becomes he's going to free those slaves in areas that are not under Union control. So when I give it to my students to read, it's like, what are all these parentheses? What are all these exceptions? And this is why the Emancipation Proclamation stock has sort of plummeted a little bit over time. It goes up and down, but it's still, you know, the remarkable document that opens the door to emancipation, as I argued in this lecture and as everyone argues over, Lincoln will never turn back from it, right? So he's also looking for the constitutional way in which to do it. You follow that? So Lincoln and the Constitution is a great topic. You a senior? Are you a student here? What year? Fantastic. capstone project in 3 years. Lincoln and the Constitution. You hear me? And I better get an email from you sharing that with me. All right? But this is great stuff. This is great stuff. This is how you begin to get capstone projects, and you have to start thinking about this stuff now. Why don't we take one more question, and then people, I'm sure, want to go get a drink or something. I see back there a hand.
You mentioned Louisiana. What kind of resources did Lincoln put in elections in Louisiana compared to today?
You wouldn't happen to have a relationship to Louisiana, would you?
No.
I'm not sure what you mean by resources. I mean, he kept, part of the tension with the whole military governor thing is ultimately who has power. So Banks, the commander, right, of the military district didn't like the idea, of answering to the military governor. And ultimately, Lincoln sort of bypasses the military governor he appointed in Louisiana and gives Banks all the authority in order to do what needs to be done in order to get elections held. I mean, he's zealous about this. I mean, he's obsessed with it because particularly to have a Deep South state restored to the Union in this way, right, by adopting a constitution and being restored to proper practical relationship, that to him would mean everything. So when you say resources, it was the resources of his office telling Banks, do what has to be done to get these elections held and to get representatives elected, and I will try to do what I can do to get them seated and restored. Of course, Congress there, and that's part of the story I told tonight, is going to oppose it. Let me finish with something I like to talk about all the time when I talk about Lincoln. And you've all seen the Lincoln movie, right? Lincoln Vampire Hunter. It's fantastic. It really is an interesting movie, but I'll leave that aside. Right, there's that moment where Daniel Day-Lewis is unbelievable, right, the embodiment of Lincoln. And he's sitting at his table, and he's playing with his pocket watch. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, know this, but some of you don't. And all you hear in the soundtrack is Spielberg got permission for his sound engineer to wind Lincoln's pocket watch and record the actual sound. And when we hear that sound in that movie, we are hearing the actual sound that Lincoln himself heard. And I get chills thinking about that, in part because we need always to be reminded, I think, of the brevity of American history. How close it is still to us. I once gave a lecture, and afterwards a man said to me, I'd like you to meet my father. The man was in his 90s, and he told me he was here for the 75th reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg. Was that 1937? I can't do math. 38, thank you. 75th reunion. And that he shook the hand of someone who fought in the battle. And I shook this guy's hand. So I shook the hand of a man who shook the hand of a man who fought here in 1863. It's why history is so important. It's so close to us still, and why it's so significant. And I'm talking to an audience that's here and that's converted to it, to think hard about it, to study it, and to value it. Thank you so much for having me this evening. This was amazing. Thank you.